With the new Space Wolves on the horizon, I figured it was the perfect time to come up with a fresh painting scheme for those grizzled warriors of Fenris. Before I get my hands on the new army box, I wanted to dive in with one of the most iconic heroes of the chapter, none other than Ragnar Blackmane himself. It seems like the STC for proper dark grey paint was lost sometime around the Horus Heresy, because while the Space Wolves are traditionally described as having storm grey armour, Games Workshop tends to go with a much lighter, almost baby blue look. Now, don't get me wrong, I do like that scheme, but it can come off a bit too bright and cartoonish for my taste. So for this project, I'm aiming to keep that classic Space Wolf feel, but shift things towards a slightly darker, more grounded grey tone. Quick disclaimer, like usual, before we dive in, this paint scheme does rely on an airbrush, and I could not overstate how much an airbrush can elevate your hobby, especially if you're batch painting. They are definitely worth the investment. I've assembled the entire model except for the power pack and the head. Those are held in place with a bit of blue tack for now, and I've also tacked the model onto the base temporarily. Once everything's in position, I hit all of it with a coat of black primer. Once the primer's dry, I lay down a solid even coat of the Fang. This will act as the shadow tone for Ragnar's armor, so getting good coverage here is key. Next, I switched to some Tamiya XF2 flat white in the airbrush, thinned it slightly with some Tamiya XF20A thinner at a ratio of 2:1. So 2 parts paint and 1 part thinner. I run my compressor at around 13 psi. When spraying, I hit all the reflective surfaces and the natural highlighted areas, basically anywhere where light would hit the armor. Think of this step as building your contrast foundation. The combination of the Fang and the white highlights will give depth to the grey tones later. The stronger the contrast now, the more dynamic and vibrant the result will be. Next up, I seal everything with a gloss varnish. This not only protects all the work we've done so far, but it also preps the surface perfectly for the next step. Panel lining with a black oil wash. To do this, I thin down some black oil paint with white spirits until it's about the consistency of ink. Fluid enough to flow into the recesses, but not so runny that it floods the whole model. Using a long bristled brush, I carefully apply a pin wash to all the panel lines and recesses. If any of the wash spreads where it shouldn't, don't worry, because once it's dry, just take a Q-tip, lightly dampened with some white spirits, and gently wipe away the excess. Go easy though, let the spirits do the work. You're just reactivating the oil so you can clean up the edges without risking damage to the paint underneath. Once the oil wash is fully dry, I seal everything with a matte varnish. This locks in the oils and evens out the finish to give us a nice and smooth surface for the next stage. It also helps the next layer to go on cleaner and much more predictably. Now it's time to lay down the grey. I'm using Space Wolf's contrast paint through the airbrush, running at about 15 psi. With contrast paints, just like inks, enamels or washes, you don't need high pressure like you would with standard acrylics. Lower psi gives you more control. The aim here is to build up a smooth, even coat across the model to get that cold storm grey tone. Take your time with it. If you lay it on too heavy, you will end up drowning out the contrast between the shadows and the highlights. And the depth is what really makes this model pop. Now that we've got the main armor color down, it's time to focus on the face, arguably the most important part of any miniature, since it's the focal point. I start with 2 coats of Cadian flesh tone. Once that's completely dry, I apply a layer of Dreadful Visage contrast paint. It's a very subtle tint, but it adds a faint cold tone to the skin, helping it feel more at home in the icy environments of Fenris. Next, I take some thinned down pink horror and carefully paint the inside of the mouth and under the eyelids, just to add a bit of warmth and life into those areas. Then, using Pallid Witch Flesh through an airbrush, I gently hit all the raised areas of the face to bring out the highlights. To pull everything together, I go over the face with a light coat of Guilliman Flesh contrast paint. This helps blend all the tones smoothly. And then once that's dry, I switch to Vallejo Black to paint the hair, the eyes, and the teeth. I also go back in with some pink horror to touch up the mouth. For the teeth, I base them with Xandri dust to give a natural shadow. Then I pick them out with ivory, painting each tooth individually. Quick tip, your 2 front teeth should line up with the nose. Well, unless you're Tom Cruise. Sorry if you didn't know that, you probably now can never unsee it. Next up is probably the trickiest part, painting 2 clean white dots in the corners of the eyes. It's actually easier to paint the whites than it is the pupils. If any white strays onto the eyelids, just tidy it up with a little bit of Cadian flesh tone. Once that's all cleared up, you've tackled one of the hardest steps, and with any luck, Ragnar is now staring down at his enemies instead of in 2 different directions. At this stage, I do a little bit of housekeeping, blacking out all the metallics, cloth, and other detailed areas, including his black undersuit and left shoulder pad. Now, if you are batch painting or working on an army, I wouldn't stress too much about these smaller elements at this stage, but since I'm focusing just on a single character model, I took the extra time to get those areas prepped properly. After that, I switched to Vallejo Air White in the airbrush and focus on the brightest areas of the cape, building up a nice clean highlight. Once that's dry, I go over the whole thing with Fleshed Terror's Red contrast paint through the airbrush. This gives the cape a rich, deep red tone while keeping all that lovely light and shadows underneath. For the fur, I start with a base coat of Wraithbone. Then I give it a shade with Soulblight Grey. After that, I use Wildwood through the airbrush to darken sections of the fur. Once that's dry, I give it a simple dry brush of pure white to pick out any of the texture. Then go over it with Skeleton Horde contrast paint for a more natural tone. I also use Skeleton Horde on the wolf's claws to add more depth. I also apply Basilian Grey contrast paint to the underside of the fur and the wolf's paws. Then I do mask off the model a little bit with airbrush putty so I can spray the tips of the claws with Wraithbone to give them a really nice transition. For the shoulder pad, I airbrush Vallejo White onto the black to add highlights and also cover Frostfang, Ragnar's chainsword. Then I spray Space Wolf's Grey contrast paint over the white that we did on the shoulder pad. For Frostfang, I airbrush Baal Red contrast paint to the lower half, blending it to white just before the center. Then for the top, I spray Bad Moon Yellow, blending it into the red to create a warm orange transition. I black out the teeth of the sword to prep for detailing later. Time for all the leather pouches and holsters. I paint them with pure white. This doesn't need to be smooth. The roughness actually adds to the leather texture once we go over it with Snakebite leather contrast paint. I applied 2 coats of Snakebite leather to build up a really rich and deep tone. For the handles on Frostfang and also any hair ties, I paint them all white and go over them with Fleshed Terror's Red. Once that's dry, I add a little bit of shading with some Agrax Earthshade. For the belt trim, I also start with a smooth coat of white and then go over it with Flesh Tearer's red as well. At this stage, I apply a matte varnish to all the contrast painted areas to tone down the gloss and unify the finish. Time for some metallics. I start with some lead belcher on all the chains, Frostfang's teeth, power pack vents, pipes and rivets, and also claws on his boots. After that, I shade those areas with some Agrax Earthshade. And dry brush them with some Stormhost Silver to brighten everything up. For the brass details, I use 2 solid coats of Runelord brass. Once dry, I apply Guilliman Flesh contrast paint for some nice rich depth. But then I go back and highlight all the raised areas with some more Runelord brass. And then finally, I dry brush Canoptic Alloy to add a lustrous shine. If any of the metallics spill over onto the armor, I do clean it up using the Fang. And also for any mess on the black shoulder pad, I do touch it up with black, as well as during this time I hit all the recesses with some black paint as well. I paint all the gems with pure white first. Then I hit them with some Bale Red contrast paint. For the highlights, I add a small edge highlight with pure white. Then I go over it with a mix of Bale Red and Bad Moon's Yellow, 2 parts yellow to 1 part red, to give it a nice warm glow. To finish Frostfang, I apply a gloss varnish to help the oil wash settle clearly into the carved recesses. Then once dry, I use a Q-tip with a little white spirits to clean up any excess, and then to seal it once more with matte varnish. I paint all the runes with Dawnstone. Followed by a dry brush of Sky Grey. Then I give them just a quick shade with Basilium Grey contrast paint. For the ornamental fangs, I used Wraithbone, then wash them with Skeleton Horde. I then do add a second layer of Skeletal Horde, just the lower half, to add some real nice contrast, as well as using some lead belches for any clips and fasteners. I attach the power pack and head using super glue instead of plastic glue, since it won't really react with all the paint that's on the miniature. Then I go back with some black to touch up the hair where paint had actually rubbed off during me handling it. I give it a dry brush with Dark Reaper. Then do some edge highlights with Administratum Grey. And clean up any of the overbrushed areas with black again in the recesses. I remove Ragnar from the base and start building a rocky outcrop with 4mm corkboard, positioning the model at the center. To keep a clean base rim, I wrap masking tape around the edge, then cover the cork with Vallejo earth texture paste. While it's still wet, I stipple it with a brush to add some roughness, then peel the tape for that clean edge. I prime the base black. Spray it with some Dark Reaper, and then hit the top surfaces with Dawnstone for highlights. Once dry, I dry brush it with Administratum Grey. For the stone ruins at Ragnar's feet, I use Agrax Earthshade, then dry brush it with Dawnstone. The Orc skull gets a coat of Wraithbone, followed by a heavy Skeleton Horde wash, and then any of the pipes and wires are painted with Lead Belcher, then a quick shade of Agrax Earthshade, and then just dry brushed with Stormhost Silver. To finish it off, I add some Army Painter Frozen Tufts and generously apply Valhalla Blizzard Technical Paint across the base, focusing on areas where snow would realistically build up. Finally, I paint the base rim black, and with that, Ragnar is ready to lead the Space Wolves on their next epic saga. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to share your own models or just chat about all things Warhammer, be sure to join our Discord. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. To the community of painters, players, and lore masters, thank you so much for joining me today. Your enthusiasm and support fuel this channel and our shared passion of the grimdark that is Warhammer 40k. Until our next adventures across the warp, I'll see you War Masters next time.